You're Cartimandua, Queen of the Brigantes, the largest Celtic tribe in Britain. Your kingdom stretches from coast to coast, your warriors number in the tens of thousands, and your word is law across a territory larger than modern-day Scotland. You've just received word that your husband Venus has fallen in battle against the Roman 9th Legion. The screams of your people echo through burning villages as red-cloaked soldiers march toward your hill-fort palace. You think the worst is over. Your kingdom is lost. Your husband is dead, but you're still alive. You still have your dignity, your royal blood, your identity as a queen. But you're wrong. Dead wrong. What happened next wasn't just conquest. It wasn't even just slavery. What the Romans did to the wives of defeated kings was a systematic program of psychological warfare so calculated, so brutally efficient, that modern historians struggle to even discuss it in academic papers without trigger warnings. This actually happened. The Romans didn't just document it, they perfected it. They turned psychological destruction into a science. Before we go any deeper into this rabbit hole, we need to establish our sources, because what I'm about to tell you isn't speculation or historical fiction. It's documented fact that's been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years. Gaius Cornelius Tacitus, Rome's most respected historian, documented these practices in excruciating detail in his annals. But here's what most people don't know. Tacitus was writing for a Roman audience. He wasn't condemning these practices. He was explaining why they worked so well. Cassius Dio, writing his Roman history 2 centuries later, provides even more disturbing details. He had access to military archives that Tacitus couldn't see, documents that were classified for over 100 years after the events. But the real smoking gun is the archaeological evidence. In 1982, excavations at the Roman fortress of Isca Augusta in Wales uncovered something that made the archaeological team physically sick. Specialized holding cells, built specifically for high-value female captives. Not just prisons, psychological manipulation chambers. The cells had viewing windows positioned at specific heights to maximize psychological impact on the occupants. They had acoustic properties designed to amplify certain sounds while muffling others. The Romans had literally engineered spaces for breaking human minds, and those are just the facilities we've found. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are dozens more sites across the former Roman Empire. We're literally walking over mass graves of psychological warfare. The numbers are staggering. Roman military records, and I mean actual bureaucratic documents, not propaganda, show over 400 documented cases of captured royal wives between 200 BCE and 100 CE. But military historians like Dr. Sarah Morrison at Oxford estimate the real number was closer to 2,000. That's 2,000 women, queens, princesses, daughters of kings, each one subjected to what Roman documents euphemistically call comprehensive behavioral modification protocols. And if you think this content is intense, you need to smash that subscribe button right now, because we're about to dive into documentation that most history channels won't touch. The algorithm pushes content that gets early engagement, so hit that like button and let's show YouTube that real history matters. But first, I need to warn you, what we're about to explore is going to change how you think about the Roman Empire forever, because every statue of Caesar, every movie about gladiators, every romanticized portrayal of Roman civilization, it's all built on a foundation of systematized psychological torture that would make modern war criminals sick. Picture this. You're Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, governor of Roman Britain. It's 60 CE, and you've just crushed Boudicca's rebellion. Standard military procedure would be to execute the royal family publicly and move on to the next campaign. But you don't follow standard procedure, because you've received new orders from Rome. Orders that turn psychological warfare into an art form. The Romans called it dignitas destitutio, the systematic destruction of dignity. And it wasn't some random cruelty dreamed up by sadistic soldiers. This was official imperial policy, developed by the smartest minds in the empire, and refined over decades of practical application. Let me read you the actual opening line from the captured protocol manual found at Vindolanda. The complete subjugation of rebellious populations requires not merely the defeat of their armies, but the systematic destruction of their capacity to conceive resistance. Think about that for a second. They weren't just trying to win battles, they were trying to destroy the very concept of resistance in the human mind. And it started the moment a queen was captured. Roman field manuals. Yes, they had actual field manuals for this, specified exact procedures for the initial seizure. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the queen might still have hope for rescue. Too late, and she might have processed the grief enough to maintain psychological resistance. The optimal window was between 6 and 12 hours after confirmation of the king's death. Just long enough for despair to set in, not long enough for acceptance to begin. But here's where it gets systematically brutal. They had different protocols for different types of queens. Celtic queens, who valued warrior honor, received one treatment. Germanic queens, with their emphasis on tribal loyalty, got another. Egyptian queens, accustomed to divine status, faced specialized procedures designed specifically to shatter their sense of godhood. The Romans had studied their enemies so thoroughly that they could predict exactly which psychological pressure points would cause the fastest mental breakdown in each cultural group. Let's follow the standard protocol for a Celtic queen like Cartimandua. Step 1. Immediate isolation from all cultural symbols. Every piece of Celtic jewelry, every traditional garment, every object that connected her to her identity as a Brigantes queen, stripped away and catalogued. But they didn't just take these items. They documented exactly what each piece meant to her. Roman interrogators had been trained to recognize the signs of particular attachment: the necklace her mother gave her, the bracelet from her wedding ceremony, the crown that had been in her family for generations. Because step 2 was psychological amplification, they would describe in excruciating detail exactly what was being done to these meaningful objects. The family crown would be melted down to make chamber pots for Roman soldiers. The wedding bracelet would be given to a prostitute in the forum. Step 3. Cultural inversion. Everything that had marked her as royal in Celtic society was systematically reversed. Celtic queens wore their hair in elaborate braids that took hours to create and symbolize their connection to the spirit world. Roman captors would shave their heads completely, then force them to wear elaborate Roman wigs, expensive, beautiful, and utterly foreign. The genius of this approach was that it wasn't just humiliation, it was identity confusion. Looking in a mirror, these women wouldn't recognize themselves. The psychological term is dissociation, and the Romans had figured out how to weaponize it 2,000 years before psychology existed as a science. Step 4. Transportation protocols. The journey to Rome wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. Every aspect was designed for maximum psychological impact. The route deliberately passed through territories where other Celtic tribes could see their defeated queen. The timing ensured arrival during major Roman festivals, when crowds would be largest. The transportation vehicle itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, not a crude cage that would generate sympathy, but an elegant litter that looked almost like an honor guard. From a distance it might appear that the Celtic queen was being treated with respect. Only up close could observers see the subtle restraints, the monitoring devices, the constant surveillance. And every mile of that journey, Roman psychological specialists were documenting her mental state. How quickly was the initial shock wearing off? What signs of resistance were emerging? Which techniques were proving most effective at maintaining compliance? Because by the time they reached Rome, they needed a complete psychological profile. What motivated her? What did she fear most? What gave her strength? What would break her completely? But wait. What I just described, the capture, the transportation, the systematic stripping of identity, that was just the appetizer. The real psychological warfare began once they reached Rome. Roman documents refer to the next phase as elevated integration, which sounds almost benign, doesn't it? Like some kind of cultural exchange program. It wasn't. It was the most sophisticated psychological torture system ever devised by the ancient world. They housed captured queens in special facilities called domus custodia, custody houses. These weren't dungeons. They were luxurious villas with every comfort a queen could want. Servants, fine food, beautiful clothes, entertainment, everything except freedom. Let me tell you about the villa where Cartimandua spent 3 years. Archaeological excavations completed in 2019 revealed the exact layout. 36 rooms spread across 4 acres of gardens. A private bath complex that would have impressed Caesar himself. A library stocked with Celtic texts, carefully selected to reinforce her isolation from her former life. But every single person in that villa was a Roman intelligence asset. The cook who prepared her favorite Celtic dishes? Roman spy, trained to notice changes in appetite that might indicate psychological state. The servant who helped her dress? Roman agent, documenting which clothing choices she made and what they revealed about her mental condition. Even the other captives were intelligence assets. Yes, there were other captives. The Romans discovered that complete isolation drove subjects insane too quickly to be useful. So they provided companions, other captured royalty who had already been successfully integrated and now served as unwitting psychological manipulators. Picture Cartimandua sitting in that beautiful garden, sharing her fears and hopes with Brigantia, a captured Germanic princess who had become her closest friend. What Cartimandua didn't know was that Brigantia had spent 2 years being prepared for exactly this role. Every conversation they had was reported back to Roman psychological specialists within hours. The sophistication was breathtaking. Roman psychologists had identified that different personality types responded to different social pressures. Naturally trusting individuals were paired with converted captives, who would slowly introduce Roman perspectives. Naturally suspicious individuals were given obviously false companions to reinforce their paranoia, then rescued by seemingly genuine friendships that were actually the real manipulation. And here's what made me physically sick when I first read about it in the Vindolanda documents. They documented everything. Every conversation was transcribed, every emotional reaction was catalogued, every technique was tested, refined and incorporated into their training manuals. Roman bureaucrats recorded daily reports on each captive's psychological state. They noted when resistance began to break down. They tracked which methods worked fastest on different cultural backgrounds. They developed psychological profiles so detailed that they make modern intelligence assessments look primitive. Let me read you an actual entry from Cartimandua's file, dated 3 months after her capture. Subject continues to maintain internal resistance despite external compliance. Recommend introduction of false intelligence regarding potential rescue attempts, followed by staged discovery of betrayal by remaining loyal supporters. They were going to make her believe her own people had abandoned her, not through obvious lies she could reject, but through elaborate deceptions so sophisticated that she would reach that conclusion herself. And it worked. Roman records show that within 6 months Cartimandua had stopped asking about rescue. Within a year she was actively discouraging other captives from maintaining hope for liberation. Within 2 years she was providing intelligence about Celtic military tactics to Roman generals. But here's the part that should terrify you. This wasn't happening to just one woman. By 50 CE, every Roman province had received standardized manuals for implementing these protocols. The exact same techniques that broke Cartimandua were being applied simultaneously to captured royalty across 3 continents. By the reign of Claudius, this wasn't happening in isolated cases. Roman governors across the entire empire had received what they called comprehensive prisoner management protocols. From Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, the same systematic approach to psychological destruction. Let me tell you about 3 specific cases that happened simultaneously in 47 CE. In Britain, Queen Cordelia of the Trinovantes was undergoing integration at a facility outside Londinium. In Germany, Princess Thusnelda of the Cherusei was being processed at a villa near Mogontiacum. In North Africa, Queen Amanishakheto of Kush was receiving cultural realignment at a compound outside Alexandria. Different continents, different cultures, different languages, identical psychological warfare techniques. The Romans had created the world's first industrial-scale mind control operation, and they were constantly improving the system. Roman military records show regular conferences where governors would share successful innovations. New techniques tested in Germany would be distributed to Britain within months. Psychological breakthroughs developed in Egypt would be implemented across the entire empire before the next campaigning season. The most chilling document in the entire archive is something called the Annual Efficiency Report from 52 CE. It reads like a corporate performance review, except it's measuring how quickly they could break human minds. Germanic subjects show 23% faster compliance rates when isolated from cultural symbols versus gradual removal protocols. Celtic subjects respond optimally to false rescue scenarios introduced at 4-month intervals. Egyptian subjects require specialized divine status negation techniques for effective processing. They were treating human psychological destruction like an engineering problem, and they were solving it. But the truly insidious part was how they normalized it. By 60 CE, Roman citizens expected these public displays of captured royalty. They brought their families to watch the parades. They discussed the psychological techniques at dinner parties. They placed bets on how long each new captive would maintain resistance. Mothers would point out captured queens to their daughters as moral lessons about the consequences of opposing Rome. Children grew up believing that the systematic psychological destruction of enemy leaders was not just acceptable, but admirable. The cultural impact was generational. Roman poetry from this period celebrates not just military victory, but the specific psychological techniques used on captives. Ovid wrote extensively about the art of enemy transformation. Martial composed entire verses celebrating the systematic breaking of foreign queens, and it worked exactly as intended. By 70 CE, the mere threat of what would happen to royal wives was enough to make most kings negotiate surrender before fighting began. The psychological warfare program had become so infamous that potential resistance leaders would include specific protections for their families in surrender terms. Roman military records show a 400% increase in preemptive surrenders between 50 and 100 CE. They didn't need massive military campaigns anymore. Fear did the work for them. What's truly chilling is how the Romans turned this into a self-perpetuating system. Every successful psychological conversion created another tool for converting future captives. Every broken queen became a weapon against the next generation of resistance. Did they maintain this system across an empire spanning 3 continents and involving hundreds of simultaneous operations? The answer lies in something that would make modern corporations envious: the most sophisticated administrative network the ancient world had ever seen. Every aspect was compartmentalized. The guards who transported captives didn't know about the psychological profiles. The servants who monitored daily behavior didn't understand the larger manipulation strategies. The administrators who processed reports didn't interact with the subjects themselves. This wasn't accidental. Roman planners had realized that complete knowledge of the system's cruelty might create moral qualms among participants. But if each person only saw their small piece, if the guard just saw transportation, if the servant just saw daily care, if the administrator just processed paperwork, then everyone could maintain plausible moral distance. Let me walk you through the actual administrative process for a single captive. When Queen Boudicca's daughters were captured after the rebellion, their processing involved 47 different Roman officials across 12 different departments. Department of Military Intelligence handled initial psychological assessment. Department of Provincial Affairs managed transportation logistics. Department of Urban Planning selected appropriate facilities. Department of Personnel assigned specialized staff. Department of Cultural Affairs provided ethnic-specific manipulation techniques. And each department had its own promotion structure, its own performance metrics, its own career advancement opportunities. Roman officials could build entire careers specializing in psychological warfare against captured royalty. Marcus Lutatius Catulus started as a junior clerk processing transport documents for Germanic captives in 45 CE. By 63 CE, he was the empire's leading expert on Celtic psychological vulnerabilities, commanding a staff of 200 and an annual budget that would equal millions in today's currency. But the genius was in the incentive structure. Every Roman official involved received performance bonuses based on measurable outcomes. Faster psychological breakdown meant larger bonuses. More complete compliance meant better performance reviews. Innovation in technique meant career advancement. The financial records are nauseating. A successful integration of a high-value captive generated bonus payments equivalent to 5 years of normal salary for everyone involved. Developing a new psychological technique that was adopted empire-wide could set a Roman official up for life. And they made sure everyone knew about the rewards. Annual ceremonies honored the most innovative practitioners of psychological warfare. The emperor himself would present awards for excellence in behavioral modification. These ceremonies were attended by thousands and celebrated throughout the empire. But surely some Romans objected to this systematic cruelty. They did. And here's how Rome dealt with them. Senator Marcus Caecilius publicly criticized the treatment of Gaulish royal captives in 43 CE. He gave an impassioned speech in the Senate, calling the psychological manipulation protocols unworthy of Roman dignity and barbarism disguised as policy. 3 days later, he was found dead in his home, officially ruled suicide. His family received a generous pension and never spoke about it again. But Caecilius wasn't the only one. Roman records show 17 documented cases of officials who raised moral objections to the captive protocols between 40 and 80 CE. 16 of them died under mysterious circumstances within a month of voicing their concerns. The 17th tribune Lucius Valerius Maximus publicly recanted his objections and became one of the system's most enthusiastic supporters. The message was clear: you could profit from the system, or you could die questioning it, but you couldn't ignore it. The elimination wasn't just individual. Entire philosophical schools that raised ethical concerns about the treatment of captives found themselves under investigation for promoting sedition. The Academy of Moral Philosophy in Athens, which published treatises questioning the psychological manipulation of prisoners, was shut down in 58 CE. All 23 faculty members were arrested on charges of corrupting Roman youth with foreign ideologies. But the most chilling aspect was how they turned moral objection itself into a tool for identifying threats. Roman psychological specialists had developed what they called ethical vulnerability assessment, techniques for identifying individuals whose moral sensibilities might make them unreliable participants in the captive protocols. They looked for specific behavioral markers. Did an official show excessive concern for captive welfare? Did they ask questions about the long-term psychological effects of the techniques? Did they express interest in alternative approaches that might be more humane? These indicators marked them for special attention. The genius was that they created a system where moral conscience became a liability that could be detected, documented, and eliminated before it became a problem. By 70 CE, questioning the psychological warfare protocols wasn't just dangerous, it was literally unthinkable. The system had created its own moral universe where torture was efficiency, cruelty was policy, and systematic psychological destruction was patriotic duty. But Rome's greatest strength became its ultimate weakness. They got so good at psychological warfare that they started using it on each other. The turning point came in 193 CE during the Year of the Five Emperors. When Septimius Severus marched on Rome, he didn't just defeat his rivals militarily, he applied the exact same captive protocols to their wives and daughters that had been used on foreign queens for centuries. Think about the psychological impact of this moment. For 250 years, Roman citizens had watched foreign queens being systematically broken in public displays. They had cheered these demonstrations of Roman superiority. They had brought their children to see what happened to those who opposed the empire. Now they watched their own elite women subjected to the same systematic humiliation, the wives of senators, the daughters of generals, the mothers of consuls, all processing through the same psychological destruction protocols that had been perfected on Celtic and Germanic royalty. The cognitive dissonance was devastating. Roman matrons who had attended dinner parties where they discussed the fascinating techniques being used on barbarian captives now saw their own friends and relatives experiencing those same techniques. Picture Livia Drusilla, wife of Senator Gaius Antonius, watching her daughter being paraded through the forum in the same degrading manner as countless foreign queens before her. Except now, instead of cheering, the Roman crowd stood in horrified silence as they realized the implications. If these techniques could be used on Roman women, women of their own class, their own culture, their own families, then no one was safe. The system they had celebrated when applied to others had become a weapon that could be turned on anyone. Within a single generation, the practice had become politically toxic even within the empire. Roman senators who had voted for funding increases to the psychological warfare programs suddenly found themselves demanding investigations into abuses of imperial power. The same crowds that had cheered the breaking of foreign queens now rioted when Roman women were subjected to identical treatment. The same techniques that had been celebrated as demonstrations of Roman superiority were now condemned as tyrannical excesses unworthy of civilized people. The last recorded instance of the formal captive queen protocol was in 235 CE, not because Rome suddenly developed a conscience, but because the system had cannibalized itself. The psychological warfare techniques that had been so effective against foreign enemies proved equally effective at destroying Roman unity when turned inward. Here's what keeps me up at night. These techniques didn't disappear, they evolved. Every authoritarian regime in modern history has used variations of Rome's systematic psychological approach. The combination of public humiliation, false comfort, documented surveillance, economic incentives for collaboration, and systematic elimination of opposition, it's all there in the 20th century's darkest chapters. The Nazis documented their concentration camp procedures with the same bureaucratic precision the Romans used for their captive protocols. The Soviets developed psychological manipulation techniques that directly paralleled Roman integration methods. The Khmer Rouge systematized cultural destruction, using principles that would have been familiar to Roman psychological specialists. But it's not just historical regimes. Modern corporate psychology, advertising manipulation, social media algorithms, they all use refined versions of techniques the Romans pioneered for breaking human will and replacing it with compliance. Think about it. The Romans discovered that complete isolation drove people insane too quickly to be useful, so they provided carefully selected companions who were actually psychological manipulators. How is that different from social media platforms that carefully curate your social connections to influence your beliefs and behaviors? The Romans found that obvious coercion created resistance, so they developed elaborate systems that made subjects believe they were making free choices while being systematically manipulated. How is that different from modern behavioral economics that nudges people toward predetermined decisions while maintaining the illusion of free will? The Romans compartmentalized their system so that most participants never saw the full scope of the cruelty they were enabling. How is that different from modern bureaucracies where individuals perform seemingly innocent tasks as part of larger systems of exploitation they never fully comprehend? The Romans created financial incentives that made participation in systematic cruelty more profitable than moral resistance. How is that different from modern economic systems that reward environmental destruction, labor exploitation, and consumer manipulation while penalizing ethical business practices? The Romans normalized psychological warfare by making it entertainment, by celebrating it in their culture, by teaching their children that it was not just acceptable but admirable. How is that different from modern societies that celebrate wealth accumulated through exploitation, that turn human suffering into entertainment, that teach children that success justifies any means? We remember these queens not as footnotes to Roman conquest, but as human beings who endured unimaginable systematic cruelty, designed specifically to destroy their capacity for psychological resistance. Cartimandua of the Brigantes, Boudicca's daughters, whose names were deliberately erased from Roman records as part of their psychological destruction. Queen Cordelia of the Trinovantes, Princess Thusnelda of the Cherusi, Queen Amanishakheto of Kush, the unnamed Celtic, Germanic, African, and Middle Eastern queens whose stories were systematically suppressed to prevent them from becoming symbols of resistance. These women weren't just victims of random violence or the chaotic brutality of war. They were subjects of calculated, documented, systematized psychological warfare designed by the most sophisticated minds of the ancient world and implemented by the most efficient administrative apparatus in human history up to that point. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It was part of a deliberate system designed to prevent future resistance by demonstrating the complete psychological destruction that awaited anyone who opposed Roman power. Every humiliation was calculated, every manipulation was documented, every technique was refined and taught to the next generation of practitioners. But their resistance wasn't meaningless either. Roman records show that even under the most sophisticated psychological pressure, many of these women maintained internal dignity that their captors could never fully break. Some left coded messages for future generations. Some managed to preserve cultural knowledge that would have otherwise been lost. Some inspired later resistance movements through their example. The Romans could break their public behavior, but they couldn't completely destroy their private selves. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective, but it wasn't perfect. Human dignity, it turns out, has a resilience that even the most sophisticated systems of oppression struggle to completely eliminate. Understanding their stories helps us honor their memory, but it also helps us understand something crucial about human psychology and systematic oppression. These techniques work. They worked 2,000 years ago, and refined versions of them continue to work today, but they don't work perfectly, and they don't work permanently. Every systematic oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction, because it inevitably creates contradictions that undermine its own foundations. Rome's psychological warfare techniques were incredibly effective at breaking external resistance, but they also created internal dynamics that eventually consumed the empire itself. The same compartmentalization that allowed participants to maintain moral distance also prevented them from understanding the full implications of their actions until it was too late. The same financial incentives that made collaboration profitable also created corruption that undermined imperial institutions. The same normalization that made brutality acceptable also made it inevitable that the techniques would eventually be turned inward. This is the lesson we need to carry forward. Systematic oppression is both incredibly powerful and ultimately self-destructive. Understanding how it works is the first step toward recognizing it, resisting it, and ultimately transcending it. So here's my question for you. What modern institutions do you think use similar systematic psychological tactics? How do we guard against normalizing cruelty just because it's efficient? And what can we learn from these ancient queens about maintaining human dignity under systematic pressure? The answers to these questions matter because the techniques the Romans pioneered didn't disappear with their empire. They evolved, they adapted, and they continue to shape our world in ways we're only beginning to understand. This has been The Hollow Throne, where we dig into the stories they don't teach in school because they're too disturbing, too complex, or too relevant to current power structures. If this content made you think differently about historical narratives and modern systems of control, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next week, we're examining what happened to the children of these captured queens. And trust me, that story is even darker than what we covered today. Because the Romans didn't just perfect techniques for breaking adult resistance, they pioneered systematic methods for preventing resistance from ever developing in the next generation. Until then, keep questioning the official story, keep recognizing the patterns, and keep remembering that understanding history isn't just about honoring the past, it's about protecting the future.